Ladies and gentlemen, Shami Chakrabarti.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that incredibly kind introduction. It's an absolute honour to be here speaking to people from the Open University. It's an institution that I think everyone in Britain should be incredibly proud of. I am particularly proud because I received an honorary doctorate from this university some years ago. I don't have any real doctorates, so the honorary doctorate is you know, some people call them plastic PhDs. I say no, it's, you know, plastic will do. Whereas some of you, no doubt, will work towards real ones. I have no doubt in due course. And I think in these very difficult times for access both to higher education and to justice, I can't think of a better place to be than with people from the Open University Law School. You've heard a little about me in that very kind introduction, but what you weren't told is that the Sun newspaper once called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. So be afraid, be very afraid. Not only am I the Jonah who arrived at Liberty the day before 9/11, the Sun newspaper called me that. And you can imagine that an accolade like that is just the gift that keeps on giving. I've had the privilege of going up and down this country and speaking to all sorts of audiences, lay audiences, legal audiences, school children, you know, literary festivals, you name it. And what a great icebreaker. The Sun newspaper once called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. And of course, the closer you get to the great city of Liverpool, the greater the likelihood that you get a standing ovation before you've even begun your talk. So imagine my consternation when that other great institution, the Daily Mail newspaper, last spring in the run-up to the general election decided that was no longer my title and gave it instead to a rather charismatic politician north of the border. Yeah. And it's worse because, to add insult to injury, the First Minister of Scotland, also a lawyer by training, is actually a little bit younger than me as well. And so there we have it. So maybe that was partly, you know, in my head when I decided it was finally time to retire as Director of Liberty. And you find me now liberated in my first 2 weeks or nearly 3 weeks of retirement. So it's glad that you still want me, but I think there's still a few more things to do. But I think I want to remind you a little bit about Liberty, because it was an organisation to which I gave 14 years of my life, and it is the subject of the book that Vivian from the Newham Bookshop will try and press upon you, because she's a great bookseller, and she's got a few left to try and get rid of after this event, and all the proceeds go to Liberty. It was formed as the National Council for Civil Liberties in 1934. And sometimes when I speak to younger audiences, the eyes glaze over. 1934, that's, you know, the Jurassic period, you know. And of course, it was a very different time to this one in so many ways. In 1934, there was practically no TV to speak of, let alone reality TV and CCTV absolutely everywhere. In 1934, DNA had not been discovered. So we certainly didn't have the capacity and the ambition to take DNA from everyone ever arrested for a crime, whether they're charged or prosecuted, let alone convicted or not. In 1934, and this is what gets the kids really, really excited, in 1934 there was no internet. And that's when my 14-year-old son's eyes really, you know, pop from his head. It's like, Mum, the Wi-Fi is down again. No, there is no Wi-Fi. There is no internet. And that means, and the internet's been an extraordinary thing. I think it's possibly the greatest innovation of my lifetime in terms of its enormous democratizing capacities. But of course, it also has its dark side, and it's not irrelevant, to say the least. It's possibly the new frontier of rights and freedoms debate in the modern age. So lots was different in 1934, but some things not different enough. Certain newspapers, one of which I've already named, would regularly run front page headlines about how awful it was that refugees were flooding into this country from Eastern Europe. And when you think about what is going to happen and what is going to be discovered in the years following 1934, shame on them, and how startling it is that those headlines are so similar today. And the dehumanising language is the same today in relation to the current refugee crisis, which is probably the greatest one since the one in the 30s. 1934 was between the wars. There were lots of people in our country with a living experience of war, and they didn't know it yet, but they were about to get more brutal experience. And of course, it was a time of great austerity and inequality, great privations for all sorts of people. But the actual trigger for the formation of the National Council for Civil Liberties was that hunger marches had come from the north of the country and some other places, from Scotland and Wales, but principally from the north of England. And they'd come all the way to Hyde Park, where they'd promptly been duffed up by the Metropolitan Police. Now, of course, that would never happen today, would it? You see, that's another interesting test of different audiences as to what kind of reaction. Some people go, no, that would never happen today. That's in Hampshire or something, I don't know. You do get, believe it or not, you do get some audiences. And when people think that it won't happen today, and I remind them also that the particular method that was used for the oppression of those peaceful dissenters was that some officers went undercover and they dressed as hunger marchers, and they behaved violently in order to trigger and justify a more violent policing response. They were agents provocateurs. And when people tell me that they don't think that that would happen today in modern Britain, I remind them of my friend Doreen Lawrence, with whom I carried the Olympic flag. I love the idea that I once carried the Olympic flag. It was very late at night, I can barely remember it, but I was the least sporty student ever, and the idea of having in some weird way been an Olympian is something that I also find amazing. So there you go, a career in the law will take you to all these strange places. But Doreen, who's a great friend, and I don't think, by the way, it's an exaggeration to say that she's possibly the greatest race equality campaigner that this country's ever known. I don't think it's an exaggeration to compare her in her way to a Luther King or a Mandela elsewhere. And unlike me, she didn't choose her path. It was rather cruelly and brutally chosen for her, as you know. And you know her story, you know. All those years ago, she suffers possibly the worst injustice, the worst cruelty that any of us can imagine, the loss of a child. We learn as human beings to deal with grief and loss, but the loss of a child is not something I think that we want to prepare for. And to lose your child in horrific circumstances, as in Doreen's case, to a racist murder, and then to know that you're not being taken seriously and your son's life is not considered worthy of adequate investigation because he's black. Now, I think some of us, quite possibly myself included, would have crawled under the duvet at that point, but not Doreen. And she launched this amazing campaign for race equality, not just for her own family, but for everyone's families. And I think it's quite right that she is now a national treasure. She is now elevated to the House of Lords. She is the Baroness Doreen Lawrence of Clarendon, and she's even been in Marks and Spencer's commercials. Which is really making it, isn't it? Which is really making it. But and she achieved all of that by virtue of her campaign and the Macpherson inquiry, another public inquiry. I sometimes imagine a dystopian future when our current generation of rather legally and constitutionally illiterate politicians who hate legal aid and lawyers and judges have got rid of all traditional lawyering. Right? No legal aid, no jury trials, none of these rather difficult judges who tell politicians off when they abuse their power. None of that. But don't worry, there will still be work for lawyers and judges dealing with public inquiries into essentially political scandals. That's the dystopian, that's my next book. No, it isn't. But thanks to Doreen's campaign, we get the Macpherson inquiry, we get the Race Relations Amendment Act, which in turn morphs into the Equality Act later on, and all of that is achieved. How wonderful. But for Doreen, the hits, they keep on coming. And only in recent years did she learn, that at the time that the police were negligently not, hello, there are people waving in the street. They're probably alums of the OU. What's that strange woman doing? That strange woman. Isn't that the second most dangerous woman in Britain? At the time when the police were not investigating Stephen's murderers, we now know that they were investigating Doreen instead. And the method used was to place undercover officers in her friendship circle, in her campaign group, in her home. So whenever you hear a senior spook or cop or Home Secretary or whoever it is tell you that the innocent have nothing to fear, have you heard this? Nothing to hide, nothing to fear? Particularly in these debates about surveillance, internet surveillance or any kind of police power. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Remember my friend Doreen Lawrence. And remember perhaps also the Greenpeace women. Do you know where I'm going with this? Yeah? Right, so these were not jihadis, my friends. These were radical vegetarians, right? The worst thing you're going to catch them in possession of some dodgy quinoa or something like that. But they're really not a threat to national security. And they went to these meetings and they met these men with who they thought they shared politics and values with, and they formed friendships and in some cases intimate relationships and partnerships and had children together, and these relationships lasted for up to 7 years. And then the relationship dissolves, and years later they find out that their former partner, who's in the family photos, was actually an undercover police officer from the Special Demonstration Squad of the Metropolitan Police. And to this day, it has not been conceded that that kind of activity should be outlawed per se. And to this day, there is no external warrantry, there's no judicial warrant, there's no even political warrantry for the use of undercover cops. So a politician's warrant to tap your telephone if you're suspected of criminality, and a judge's warrant to search your premises, but not potentially for the greatest intrusion of all, which is to put an undercover officer in your home, in your bed. But that's all right, isn't it? Because the innocent have nothing to fear. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Perhaps the slogan that in many ways best represents what I have been up against in my career, both as a Home Office lawyer and then subsequently at Liberty. But back to the hunger marches, they were brutally put down, and it was a scandal. It was rightly a scandal in its day. And so a group of people, far smaller than the group gathered here this evening, decided, in the best British traditions, that something should be done. And so they met in the crypt of St Martin in the Fields Church in Trafalgar Square, where you can get nice coffee and cake, and you know, opposite the National Gallery, you know what I'm talking about. And they met in February 1934, and they were going to do something about this. Now, of course, today they would have blogged or tweeted or Snapchatted or you can tell that I'm not really comfortable with the language, but I'm putting up the best show that I can. They would have started a petition on change.org, but remember, no internet. So instead, they have their meeting, their first meeting, and they write a letter to what was then called the Manchester Guardian newspaper. Today, The Guardian, and they put in this letter their resolve to do something about the terrible abuses that they had witnessed and to keep watch over the entire spirit of liberty in our country. They had formed the National Council for Civil Liberties. The audacity, it's fantastic. They had no royal charter. They had no official imprimatur of any kind. They, just a group of concerned people, formed the organisation that I was caretaker of for 12 years, but is now going strong, for 82 years. And this group of ne'er-do-wells, they never did anything else much with their lives. People like, I know, Clement Attlee and Vera Brittain and H.G. Wells, and the list goes on. And interestingly, the letters really dull. Some of them are great writers, but letters by committee. You know about that. Very bad idea. But the sentiments and the values are still incredibly important. Fast forward, the next really important moment in my story, and that is post-World War II. And that, to me, is where the international human rights story really begins. It's a yet-to-be-repeated moment in human history, where people slightly to the right of the political centre, slightly to the left of the centre of democratic politics, people who represent all the great world religions and people of no religious conviction whatsoever come together and decide that if we as a species are not perennially to descend into barbarism and war, we must agree on some basic, universal, non-negotiable values. Yet to be repeated. I've never seen anything like it subsequently in human history. And that, of course, is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Mrs. Roosevelt's legacy, and in turn, a series of continental, regional instruments that will be legally enforceable, including our own much maligned European Convention on Human Rights, Winston Churchill's legacy. So imagine that, I think sometimes the older I get, the more I think life resembles a kind of Renaissance painting, but with layers of irony where the paint should be. When I see these modern conservative politicians reneging on that settlement that was actually Churchill's legacy, and deliberately conflating it with their Euroscepticism, and deliberately linking it to the European Union and the single market and so on. That's been very hard to take sometimes, but mercifully, there are still conservatives who honour the legacy, and I think that the greatest one of those at the moment, and I believe he was on the Today programme this morning, is probably Dominic Grieve, who I suspect it remains a lawyer first and a politician second, and that possibly helps. I don't know. So what's so great about the values in the convention that in turn became our modern Bill of Rights, our Human Rights Act? Well, the right to life. That's not everlasting life, you understand, because you can't go to a lawyer for that. You need to go to a cleric or a medic or somebody else for that. But it is the right to positive protection of life and to an independent investigation into any untimely death. And I have former colleagues who are spending week after week at the moment in Woking in the coroner's court working on the deep cut inquest that would never be taking place but for the cases that we brought under Article 2 of the Convention. And one of the things that the current government says about the problem with the Human Rights Act is that the MOD should not be faced with claims, with human rights claims. And if that had been the case, there would be no deep cut inquest. This is not families and military personnel who are asking for a human right to fag breaks or cafe lattes on the battlefield. These are young people who wanted to serve their country, who never lived to serve their country because they die in these mysterious circumstances, let me put it that way, in training. Article 3 of the Convention, the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment or torture. And of course, rather tragically, we now associate that not as a distant ideal, but with torture that's been perpetrated even even by great democracies during the War on Terror. We think of things like extraordinary rendition and Guantanamo Bay and so on. But closer to home, another military case, Anne-Marie Element. Do you know her story? Anne-Marie also came from a military family, always wanted to serve, and she joined the Royal Military Police. She served in Germany, where she complained that she'd been raped by some of her comrades. And guess what? At this time, a few years ago, if you complained of rape within the Royal Military Police, guess who investigated? Yeah, the Royal Military Police. And this turned out to be a short and rather cursory investigation, and no further action was taken, save that she then faced bullying because she had blown the whistle and she had cried rape and so on. And this became unbearable for her, and she took her own life. Now, the inquest was short because the cause of death was very simple. She committed suicide. But again, using the positive obligations under the convention, in this case, the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment or torture, my colleagues, my former colleagues now, were able to get a new inquest that gave a more narrative verdict. They were able to get a new investigation, but conducted by a civilian police force. And now there are a couple of men who are facing prosecution for Anne-Marie's rape, even though she's no longer around. Justice perhaps for her family, who knows. Article 4 of the Convention, the right not to be enslaved. Now that seems completely distant in modern Britain, doesn't it? Sadly not. And did you know that until 2010, there wasn't a criminal offence in this country of holding someone as a slave? So we'd had all these celebrations into 200 years since the abolition of the slave trade, etc., etc., etc. Fine, but there was no criminal offence of holding someone as a slave. Now, if you locked somebody in, that's false imprisonment. And obviously, if you threaten them or you use violence against them, that there are a series of offences against the person that work. But slavery isn't always like that. There are different ways of bringing someone under your control. If they're a trafficked person, if they're someone with learning difficulties, there are all sorts of ways that you can enslave someone for years in domestic servitude, in the agricultural setting, in sex work and so on, without actually locking the door. And again, it was only by using Article 4 of the Convention, the right not to be enslaved, that we were able to persuade the UK government and Parliament to make a new criminal offence. And I didn't spend much of my life arguing for new criminal offences, but this was one that really needed to happen. We had all these ridiculous criminal offences into, you know, who knows what, thousands of them, but we didn't have this until 2010, courtesy of the Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. Article 5, the right to liberty and security of the person. And of course that has its seats in Magna Carta. Not much does. I have to tell you that last year I'd had it up to here with Magna Carta. All the toffs at Runnymede, you know, champagne and Pimm's and Magna Carta. I felt like Tony Hancock. Do you remember? Remember Magna Carta? Did she die in vain? These people actually read this document. There's nothing to protect you from torture or slavery or protect your speech. There's not much joy for women or Jews or anybody else in Magna Carta. But anyway, I'm much more excited about 2018 when we'll celebrate 100 years of the Representation of the People Act. I think I'll get excited about that one, but not Magna Carta. But yes, we do have Article 5 of the Convention, the right not to be detained without law. And that has been a very, very important right in recent years. And we've invoked it against policies of internment and extended detention without charge or trial, but not yet successfully for refugees and asylum seekers in this country who are still detained for weeks and months on end without proper access to law in theory or in practice. Article 6, the right to a fair trial, including presumptive innocence in criminal cases. but also including access to justice. And I'm finding it increasingly difficult to understand how that is a reality in modern Britain when civil legal aid is all but dead. All but dead. There are few areas of practice where it's still available to some very, very poor people, but most people in this country, most ordinary people in this country, in my humble opinion, no longer have access to justice, and there is no longer equality of arms in all sorts of power relationships in people's lives. And yes, if the state wants to take your child, you'll get legal aid, but if your ex-partner wants to deny you access to your child, you won't. And the list goes on into all sorts of areas of employment and benefit provision and housing and so on. And I don't think that's something to be incredibly proud of. And, you know, without access to advice and representation that I know many of you will go on to provide in your lives, all these wonderful human rights laws, all these wonderful equality laws will remain a dead letter in a sealed book and not real for people. Article 8 of the Convention, the right to respect for your private and family life, your home and your correspondence. We've already touched on this a little, but I just want to say that I think that for younger people in particular, the real debate about privacy now is online. I used the door-in example, and I used the undercover policing example, but young people are now sometimes living more intimately online than in the physical world. And this legislation that is currently pending, we call it the Snoopers Charter, the government calls it the Investigatory Powers Bill. That's what, that's campaigning and propaganda and how it, when you do work like mine, you learn there are certain words you should not use because people will turn off. If you're the Director of Liberty, one word that you should never use is Orwellian. Another one is Kafkaesque. So you start looking for these other words like chilling and draconian. And at one stage, a smartass on Twitter said, "Oh, that Chakrabarti finds everything chilling. That woman sees refrigerators everywhere." You can't say Orwellian, you can't say Kafkaesque. I think that it's time we had an adjective named after a woman writer, don't you? Because I'm told that Dickensian wasn't named for Emily. But anyway. But if I am to use Orwellian for just a moment, for me, we know about the genius of Orwell, and if everyone's read 1984 and Animal Farm, there's a bare minimum. But for me, the real genius is to be found in his essay, Politics and the English Language. And one thing I have learned is the way in which, and he sets it out so well in his essay, the way in which the abuse of language will lead to the contortion and perversion of ideas and ultimately the abuse of people. And I did really learn that in this war on terror, where extraordinary rendition did not mean beautiful singing, right? And waterboarding was not a seaside sport. But all these words can be, and prisoners are now detainees, all these words, and refugees are now migrants. Before that they were asylum seekers and bogus asylum seekers, and now they're migrants. And not in a neutral sense. And my parents were migrants. So I find it hard to consider the word migrant a dirty word. And when I heard the Prime Minister say to the leader of the opposition at PMQs just a couple of months ago, you choose to go to Calais to talk to a bunch of migrants. I have to say that was quite hard. That was quite, because I am descended from not a bunch of migrants, because it only takes two to produce this. So be afraid, perhaps the Prime Minister's right. I don't know. That was quite hard to take. But yes, language, very important not just in the law, but in politics and in activism. No question about that. So we call it the Snoopers Charter. The government calls it the Investigatory Powers Bill. But to me, it is a breathtaking breathtaking power grab and intrusion on people's online privacy. And of course there has to be balance, and of course the internet has its dark side, and just like the printing press before it, it can be a dangerous tool for bad as well as good. But the idea that agencies should have this blanket access to your communications and your weblogs and your it's easy to be a little grandiose about campaigns and achievements, and there have been successful campaigns and achievements in the human rights movement in recent years. We fought off ID cards. Simon Hughes is sitting over there. He was a great opponent of ID cards, and when he served in the coalition government, an early achievement of that, an early progressive achievement of that government was to repeal identity cards legislation. So that's a job well done. Except in my bag, I have this thing that is not an ID card, but that will show you my location data. It will show you all my contacts. It will show you my weblogs. It will show you, it's got a banking app, and it's got this thing that popped up the other day that told me how many steps I'd taken. I didn't even ask for that. An incredibly intimate picture of my life, a central hub of my identity and my information, and I pay for the privilege. This so-called civil liberties campaigner, right, spends years fighting off, the government and the state and trying to protect personal privacy, and I pay for the privilege of that device. And I spent an hour on the phone to Cork in Ireland today to get that device to talk better to my other devices so that all this information can be more easily shared. And I do it because it's cool technology and it makes my life convenient. But equally, that is a honeypot of data. And this new legislation, I think, is a blank check for the authorities, but also for hackers and fraudsters and terrorists to get access to the vulnerabilities that this kind of legislation will create. And yes, we need to balance privacy with security, but equally, a world without privacy is one without intimacy or dignity or trust between people. Article 9, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, the right to the faith of your choice, the right to no faith, and I think crucially the right to be a heretic in any faith community. To be the gay Muslim, to be the woman that wants to be a bishop, to be the woman who wrote that play Beshti in Birmingham all those years ago, and it was shut down because the baying mob was not prevented by the authorities. Article 10, freedom of expression. Right now, my speech is free. Yours is a little more expensive, but I'll stop in a moment, I promise. Again, a very, very, very acute topic in modern Britain. Not so long ago, quite rightly, our leaders went to Paris to show solidarity with murdered journalists. Quite right. Je suis Charlie is what they said in Paris. And when those same cabinet ministers came back to London, they decided that there should be greater intervention on campuses as part of their prevent agenda. And teachers and lecturers should now be spooks and policemen. And I think, again, it's a breathtaking power grab, and it's counterproductive, as so many of these intrusions are. It's actually counterproductive to security policy, in my view. Because if a school or a university does not feel like a safe and even sacred space of learning, people will just take these ideas elsewhere, and they will have their learning and their thinking elsewhere where it won't be challenged. So break that trust between teachers and students at your peril, but this seems to be the order of the day, the prevent agenda. And if it weren't bad enough that government wants to do this to universities, sometimes students will do it to themselves. This new fashion for no platforming. I'm not sure that this is something that would necessarily trouble the Open University, but it is troubling a lot of campuses around the country. Just last term, I was emailed by a women's officer at a particular university, and she told me not to come and speak at her university as had been advertised. She was writing to all the women on the term card and asking them not to come and attend and speak because not enough women are allowed to speak at the university. Yes. It was a beautifully crafted email. It was incredibly polite. And I thought about it for a bit, and I wrote back, and I thanked her for her email and suggested that she revisit her strategy on feminist grounds. That perhaps it was the equivalent of quite rightly acknowledging that the lack of female representation in Parliament is still an absolute disgrace. We don't have enough women in Parliament, in the senior judiciary, in the board, the list goes on, it's a disgrace. And so perhaps we should write to every serving woman MP and to potential candidates and tell them to boycott the next election as a protest. Anyway, she was very polite and agreed to think again. But that's a very gentle example of some of the stories that I'm hearing when I go and speak at campuses all over the country about no platforming. And I think it's a terrible mistake. It's bad enough that the government wants to shut down speech on campus. We shouldn't be doing it to each other. And whatever the ethics of no platform, whatever the ethics, it's a tactic that's now been confused with principle. Once upon a time, it might have worked. Whatever your views on it, ethically, it might have worked. In a different age, without modern technology, it might work to say, so-and-so is the only fascist in the village. We won't give him airtime and no one will listen to him. And so the local MP will not debate him, and we will not, share a conversation or a debate with him because he is an isolated nutter, end of. That might have worked once upon a time, but not in an internet age. There is no such thing as no platform in the internet age. Just narrow platforms where people talk to people who already agree with them. So I think that particular development is a mistake, and I urge students not to do that to themselves. Freedom of association, of course, under Article 11, and then my favourite human right of all. What could it be? See, when you speak to school children, they're like, and they're shouting out. I'm like, no, we've already done that one. What could be more important than the rights and freedoms that we've been through, that are all listed in the Convention and that are now made enforceable here, close to home, courtesy of the Human Rights Act, that's so under threat by a government pledge to repeal it? Well, to my mind, the key to the human rights kingdom, certainly in the Human Rights Act and the Convention, is Article 14, equal treatment under the law. Sounds a bit dry, doesn't it? We lawyers call it non-discrimination, but we humans might call it empathy. It's walking around in other people's shoes and treating other people as you would like to be treated yourself. And I think that is the key to the kingdom. Now, how, you might think, could that be more important than torture and slavery and speech and privacy and conscience? This rather esoteric sort of lawyer's proposition. Why is that so important? Well, in my opinion, it's so important, and the most important, because if we really practiced it, not just in law, but in practice all over the world, as an ethical proposition, if we really practiced equal treatment, there would be no torture, there would be no slavery, there would be no unjust intrusions into other balanced rights anywhere. Because whatever they say to you, and whatever the politicians and some of the pundits say in the media, everybody loves human rights. Everybody loves human rights. Their own. And those of their family and friends and people that they identify with. It's other people's rights that are the problem. Just like other people's kids, And that is why I think it's the key to the kingdom. And it's a way in which the courtroom and the ballot box can work together, because it allows lawyers and judges to impose a simple discipline on powerful groups and majorities and democratic majorities, that they cannot just persecute the minority and take rights from the minority that they want to continue to enjoy themselves. That's the beauty, that's the key to the kingdom, to the human rights kingdom, in my view. You may take a different view. And the choice we face, it seems to me, not just in the law, but in wider challenges that this world faces at this particular moment, the choice, it seems to me, is do we accept that we'll just be citizens with a few privileges that can be given or taken away from us by the powerful in our country? Do we choose to be citizens on one tiny corner of the globe and foreigners everywhere else? Is that enough protection for us? Or do we choose to be treated as human beings with human rights all over the planet? That's the choice, it seems to me, between a so-called British Bill of Rights and Responsibilities and our Human Rights Act. Before we move to the questions, I just want to remember Tom Bingham, who I know is very dear to your hearts as well, and you named your essay prize for him last year, I think, was the first year. Tom wasn't just perhaps the greatest jurist of my lifetime. He was also a wonderful human being and a wonderful man who vowed to defend the Human Rights Act into his retirement. Sadly, he didn't have much time left to do that. But he once addressed a big Liberty members event in Methodist Central Hall, just round the corner. And he set out all the convention rights far more eloquently than I ever could or I have just done. And he ended this way. He said, "Which of these rights would you choose to discard? Are any of them superfluous, unnecessary, un-British? There may be some who would choose to live in a country where these rights do not exist, but I am not of their number, nor am I." Thanks for listening.